Welcome to the Accela Civic Innovators podcast, where government leaders share how they're transforming operations and improving the resident experience. Today, we're headed to Stockton, California, where city leaders took a hard look at their permitting process and asked a simple question: where are things really getting stuck? Instead of relying on assumptions, Stockton leaned into data, building real-time dashboards and workflow KPIs to uncover bottlenecks, improve accountability, and deliver faster, more predictable service. We're joined by Rob Liddicoat, Deputy Director of Community Development, to talk about how data visibility transformed the city's operations and the results that followed. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Civic Innovators podcast. This is where we talk to government leaders that are transforming how services are delivered and improving the experiences for residents. I'm Noam Reininger, the CEO of Accela.
And I'm Joe Morris, Chief Innovation Officer at e.Republic. Today we're headed to Stockton, California, a city focused on strengthening service delivery, improving transparency, and using data to guide decision-making across all of its operations.
So the city of Stockton has a permitting process like a lot of other cities, a lot of handoffs, different departments, and historically, it's been very hard to get an accurate understanding of why the lead times were happening, when things were stuck, and when leadership could intervene.
Rather than relying on anecdotal explanations, Stockton leaned into data by using Accela's enhanced reporting database to analyze workflow history, build real-time dashboards, and create a clearer picture of how work actually moves through the system.
So today, we're joined by Rob Liddicoat. Rob is the Deputy Director of Community Development at the City of Stockton, and we're going to jump right into the big question. So the big question today is, how can a city leverage existing data that it already has to really understand processing times, understand where things are stuck, and understand where it can intervene, ultimately to get a better experience for constituents. Now, Rob, in terms of Stockton, maybe take us through what prompted the shift from using anecdotal data to true workflow KPIs. So how did you get there, and what were you looking to accomplish?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Well, historically, and I suspect like most agencies, we've been relying a lot on assumptions and subjective explanations about our performance. And, if there was a complaint about a specific permit, it was easy enough to look into that one particular incident to figure out exactly what happened. But that's really a far cry from telling you how you're performing overall. And it really keeps an agency in sort of a reactive type of a position. So a few years ago, when we added the enhanced reporting database, we were really excited to tap into our data to start seeing what we could do with it, because we knew that the raw information that we needed was in there. We just needed to get in there and figure out how to unleash it, so to speak. So we knew that we wanted clarity about our performance, but we also wanted better tools for our supervisors to be able to manage their teams and manage the projects that were in their queues. And that was a really important point for us, because there's usually several reviewers involved in a project, and a single missed review will cause the entire project to miss its target. So back in late 2020, we really started digging into our permit processes. We wanted clarity about where our sticking points were, where we needed to focus our improvement efforts, and how we could verify that those improvements were actually having the intended effect. We knew we had a lot of raw information in Accela already, especially the workflow history data, but there wasn't a readily available way to turn that into actionable operational visibility. And honestly, and this was super frustrating for me, being asked a very straightforward question like, how long does it take to issue a permit? Very straightforward question on the surface, but we couldn't provide a straight answer to that and it just wasn't acceptable anymore. Now, of course, that type of a question, there's a lot of nuances. What kind of a permit is it? How many review cycles did it go through? How long did it take the applicant to resubmit? Those are all very valid points, but the raw data to be able to answer those types of questions was in the system. We just needed a way to turn it into quantifiable information that we could really use.
You hit on this multi-department, multi-review kind of reality, but you also hit on the nail on the head in terms of one bottleneck stops the whole process. Before you had that visibility that you just spoke about, what was really difficult in understanding where that permit may have been getting stuck, and how did that affect coordination across teams?
Yeah, prior to this development, we could really only rely on the perceptions and assumptions as to the cause to the delays in general. Um, we just needed that broad picture. So we did an initial baseline performance analysis, and what we found was really eye-opening, and it really drove home the principle that we either succeed or fail as a team. So, for example, if there's 6 reviewers on any given project and 5 of those reviews are done in a week, but then that last reviewer took a month for whatever reason, well, then the project itself took a month because that's what the customer experienced, and that's what drove that project's overall timeline. Um, our customers don't experience departmental metrics. They don't care about departmental metrics. Their experience is with the city as one entity from the time they submit their plans until they either receive their approval or a complete set of plan review comments back. We also found that there was no single reviewer or division that was sort of, the cause of the missed reviews. Everybody had misses here or there, but the thing is when you look at the performance holistically, if one division misses these 2 projects and then another division misses those 2 projects, well, overall that adds up to 4 missed projects for the city. So having visibility into the data really allowed us to identify those pinch points throughout the process and led to much more informed operational discussions about where improvements were needed and what solutions could actually address those issues.
Wow. So, Rob, from what I understand, you got pretty hands-on with the data and you built custom calculations. This was not just import and move. What was that process of really understanding the workflows and then transforming the data to actionable insights?
Sure. As we started to develop our KPIs, we realized very quickly that the raw workflow history data doesn't itself tell the whole story. It can tell you how long individual reviewers or divisions are taking, but what we wanted to measure was that full review cycle because ultimately that's what drives that customer timeline. So we started by building our calculations based on workflow history data pulled out of the ERD. And through some trial and error, we ended up using SQL-based scripting to measure those complete review cycles and to tell us whether or not we met our target or not. And like most agencies, our timeframes vary based on what type of project it is and what review cycle it's on. So getting our durations there was relatively straightforward, but in terms of calendar days, but we also wanted to understand our performance against the city's working days. And so through that trial and error, we were able to get the scripting to account for weekends, the city holidays, and then even our city's on a 980 work schedule with alternating Fridays off. So we were able to bake all that into the scripting. So we have really 2 sets of durations that we can look at. Now, the one thing that we realized was that fortunately we had already spent a few years standardizing our workflows, and that actually became very important to this effort. The more consistent your workflows are, the easier it is to build reliable performance metrics because it reduces the amount of variations that the calculations need to account for. We also spent a lot of time validating that the KPI calcs were producing accurate durations in both those calendar and the working days and confirming if the target was met. Many iterations and a lot of diligence to make sure that the data that it was being produced was reliable. But as a result of all that work, today we have a data pipeline that actually works really well. It starts by automatically pulling the data out of the ERD about every 30 minutes. We have it on schedule. And then it processes it through our SQL environment. And then it pushes both the raw data and the new KPI data out into our Azure storage. And then our Power BI-based dashboards pull that updated information out of Azure about every 30 minutes. And then those dashboards are published out through our internal SharePoint sites. Then in addition to the performance dashboards, we also have live workload monitoring dashboards that show current reviews in progress, sort of who's got the ball on any given project at any given time. Are they overdue? Things like that. So we've really been able to make the shift from relying on the manual ad hoc reporting to near real-time operational visibility across our organization.
Sounds like you have a treasure trove of visibility and insights that are powering this. You mentioned the concept of who has the ball. How has that changed how your departments are working together and maybe holding each other accountable?
Yeah. That's really been probably the biggest operational change is having those workload monitoring dashboards. So those are based on the active workflow tasks in Accela. Those dashboards provide everybody across the organization with visibility into that same workload picture, and that includes all the pertinent details that the team and the supervisors need. So before this level of visibility, individual reviewers and divisions, they really only saw their own portion of their workload, and now everybody can see how their piece of their review fits into that broader process, and it's actually fostered a much stronger sense of ownership and collaboration across, in between the divisions and the teams. And then let's just say in terms of performance, visibility tends to be a very effective motivator. So this has really reinforced the point that we succeed or fail as a city team and not as individual contributors. Um, It's also improved coordination because supervisors can now see where projects stand across other review groups, and that gives them the ability to coordinate with those teams earlier. So those dashboards have really created a shared operational awareness that just didn't exist prior.
Um, Rob, if we explore that further, so you're getting insights into potential delays a lot earlier. And you mentioned that now different departments can see where something may be stuck across the entire life cycle of the permit. How has kind of the operation itself changed? So are there more meetings where you're looking at things holistically with the department heads? Like what's the operational cadence been like so that you can swarm, get ahead of things, and then also potentially reallocate resources to make sure that you hit deadlines?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the biggest operational changes really come from those workload dashboards specifically. It really gives the supervisors and the teams one holistic snapshot, a very clean snapshot of everything that's coming through the pipeline. And so what that does is it allows our supervisors and leadership to see those workloads and then intervene before delays compound and affect the customers. So we can now identify those bottlenecks before they become those delayed reviews, and also flag projects that might be at risk of getting stuck in those extended resubmittal loops. Um, Prior to this, those issues were really discovered after deadlines had either already been met, or a project was in its fourth, fifth review cycle, or in some cases escalated up into the city manager's or the mayor's office. And at that point, you're really just reacting instead of proactively managing the projects. So one of the biggest things is that the supervisors can now look at workload balancing. So if a supervisor sees, for example, a large block of reviews coming due kind of at the same time for the same reviewer, or if somebody has upcoming leave scheduled, then some of those assignments can be reassigned to redistribute the workload across the team. Let's see. I think another thing is that we enacted a policy change based on observations working with the data early on. Looking at the review cycle counts, it became clear that if a project was going into its third cycle review, then chances are it needed a higher level of attention and support to avoid getting it into that fourth, fifth, even sixth, sometimes seventh cycle review. So we actually put a policy in place where our team will put a meeting in place with the applicant if something's going into that third cycle review, to understand what's driving the repeated resubmittals and hopefully get that project back on track and hopefully prevent it from going into any additional review cycles. Another important shift is that the conversations really are now based on measurable data instead of assumptions. So instead of things like, well, it feels like we're understaffed, or it seems like another division is causing us delays, well, we can just look at the review volume, the turnaround times, the backlog trends, and we can just have much more informed, data-backed operational discussions and decision making. So these tools have really provided us that clear information to shift away from the reactive explanations and then move into that proactive, operational management just based on cold hard facts.
I love the cold hard facts, but I imagine as you work towards getting those, there had to be some trial and error. There had to be a lot of learning. What did going through that process teach you about building those KPIs and the dashboards so that people not only use them but trust them?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, a dashboard can look great, but it doesn't matter at all if people don't trust the numbers that are behind it. It's not going to change operations. So through that process, it really taught us that repeated validation is critical when you're developing those KPIs from the workflow history, because there's variations in the workflows and how they might be used. So we spent a lot of time testing the logic against real projects, making sure numbers reflected what was actually happening on the projects in real life. And if something looked off, we were very deliberate about figuring out what the root cause was and making the adjustments that we needed to account for it in that background scripting. So, for example, we found after we initially started out, we found a few scenarios, things like permit revisions and reissuances, where some of those nuances in the workflow history were producing inaccurate duration calculations. So they were throwing our KPIs off. So we had to dig in, figure out what was going on, and then update the scripting to account for that properly. Another big thing, and this was huge for some of our teams in particular, we ran the new dashboards, especially the workload monitoring dashboards. We ran those in parallel with existing Accela ad hoc reports for several months. And what that did is it allowed staff to compare the results side by side, especially as new projects came into the pipeline, existing projects evolved through the process. And that side-by-side comparison allowed the team to build confidence that the new data and the new dashboards were operating properly and that they could actually rely on it to manage their workload. I think another important lesson is you don't just build this and then walk away. Workflows evolve, and then as those happen, the calculations will need to evolve with them. And you got to continue paying attention to the data. And if you see something that looks a little off, you may need to dig in, understand what's going on, and then fine tune it to account for some of those nuances over time. So ultimately, building trust in that underlying data was just as important as building the trust in the dashboards themselves.
Wow. And so, Rob, in terms of building trust, I'm assuming this all had great outcomes for your customers, and that built a whole lot more trust in the department, the submittal process. So can you take us through what the outcomes were after you went through this work, you implemented the KPIs, you then had operational changes? What does it look like now for constituents and customers?
Yeah. And just to be clear, it's an ongoing, evolving process. We kind of got over that big initial hump, but definitely still a lot of work going on and planned for the future. But really, that's what it's all about, is creating a more predictable and reliable experience for our customers, and also holding ourselves to a high standard of performance. So as you mentioned, we had implemented several process improvements over the last several years. It was kind of difficult to isolate the impact of any one of those changes, but what the KPI dashboards have allowed us to do is actually measure whether those collective improvements are improving performance in the right direction, and it definitely has. The results have been pretty significant. So just a couple of examples. When we ran our original baseline performance analysis, we looked at projects between 2018 and 2020. And for new commercial construction projects, we were only meeting our initial review targets about 17% of the time. That's 17. Whereas now, I just checked them over the last 6 months, we're either meeting or beating our published timeframes a little over 85% of the time. And then one other example, some big improvements, especially looking back at our baseline before we really started this. Multifamily residential projects, we were meeting it only about 3% of the time to start, whereas in the last 6 months, we've hit every single one. We've actually hit 100% for that last 6-month period. Another big one is that we can actually now distinguish between the city's review time and then the time that's driven by the customer resubmittals and responses. And so that helps us have a more useful and honest conversation with our customer focus groups about that full permitting timeline. What pieces do we control? What do the customers control? And then how can we work together to keep the project moving and get that permit issued as fast as possible? We know speed's important, and we definitely are clear that time is money, and that's always our goal. But agencies, we're dealing with practical limits like what's our staffing levels, what's our overall workload volume. And so speed's definitely the goal. But one thing that we really focus on and strive to do is give our customers consistency and reliability and meeting their expectations in terms of, if we publish that this project should take 15 days to review and get back to them, then that is absolutely our intent, to stick to that 15 days or less. So the better visibility and internal coordination has helped us align our actual performance with our published timelines, and that has definitely benefited our customers.
Those are big, meaningful wins that you just shared with us. For cities that maybe are in the same space that you were when you started, they're looking to walk the same journey that you're on. What's the one piece of advice that you'd have for them?
Well, I would say take up some form of meditation, any form. That way you don't end up throwing your computer out the window, especially when you're working through your KPI development. No, but seriously, I would definitely suggest agencies do tap into their data, because for one, it can reveal a lot of those just cold hard facts, and it really helps you focus your process improvement efforts. And once you have access to that data, the information is what it is. And so those conversations about staffing levels, about performance, those become so much more productive when you have that level of clarity. And it also gives your supervisors the visibility they need to be able to effectively manage their workloads, before, a delayed review becomes a city manager complaint, right? Um, so I would definitely encourage agencies to standardize their workflows as much as possible, especially around the review tasks. That will help them develop those KPI calculations a lot easier. There's fewer variables to have to account for. And another important lesson is don't build a dashboard just because you can, right? Just because you have Power BI and you can put something together that looks really cool. If it's not answering an operational question, then it's not useful. So start with those operational questions first. Where are projects getting stuck? What is the customer actually experiencing? How are we performing as an agency, not just as individual departments? How are we meeting our goals? Where can supervisors and teams benefit from earlier and broader visibility? So if you start with those types of questions, then the dashboards become really valuable because they're solving real operational problems. And then I know I'm giving you more than one, I'm sorry. But lastly, just validate constantly. Don't build it and walk away. You have to keep your eye on it, especially for the first, at least in our experience, for the first year or so, because you'll see little tweaks that may need to be made here and there. So just keep an eye on it and jump on in. Don't wait for things to be perfect. Just iterate over time.
Rob, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I think your KPI data journey is extremely inspiring and insightful. And frankly, it shows that you don't really need to wait to start. You need to get in the data and get your hands dirty. But ultimately, what you showed was that with the right level of insights, you're able to make pretty material operational improvements that resulted in, better processing time, less errors, less deadlines missed for constituents and customers. So really, really insightful story. Thank you.
And I think it also shows visibility can become a service in itself. When staff knows what's happening, leadership can act earlier, and us, whether it's the customers or the residents, get clear expectations and more predictable turnaround timelines.
So until next time, keep asking the bold questions.